When the entire frontier town looked at a woman with contempt, the wildest man in the mountains stepped out and pointed directly at her. 3 words. Just 3 words changed everything. She was the outcast of the town. He was the one the town feared. No one understood why. No one expected that choice to shake the entire frontier. Press like now and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has come. And stay until the end, because this is a story the frontier will never forget. The morning of the harvest gathering started the same way every public morning in Blackthorn Crossing started for Mara Vance, with people looking at her just long enough to decide she wasn't worth looking at. She'd arrived at the settlement square before most of them, which was deliberate. If she got there early, she could find a spot near the back of the crowd, somewhere between the feed merchant's stacked crates and the wall of the old assay office, and she could watch the whole thing without anyone having to acknowledge she existed. It wasn't hiding, exactly. It was just the particular kind of invisibility she'd learned to wear like a second skin over 8 years of living in this town. Blackthorn Crossing sat in a wide valley between 2 mountain ranges in the high territory, the kind of place that drew settlers looking for cheap land and good pasture and a fresh start from whatever they'd left behind. It had grown from 3 mud-chinked cabins to nearly 200 souls in the span of a decade. And with that growth had come all the usual trappings of civilization: a mercantile, a blacksmith, a schoolhouse, a church, 2 saloons, and the elaborate social architecture that small towns always constructed, brick by invisible brick, about who mattered and who didn't. Mara Vance fell firmly into the second category. She was 31 years old and she'd been a widow for 6 of those years, ever since Thomas Vance had gone out in a late spring snowstorm to check the east pasture fence and hadn't come back. They'd found him 3 days later when the snow melted enough. The horse had bolted. He'd hit his head on a rock going down. That was the end of Thomas, and in a way, it was the end of whatever version of Mara had existed before. The problem wasn't that she was a widow. There were other widows in Blackthorn Crossing, and most of them had remarried or at least secured comfortable positions within the town's social web. The problem, as best as Mara had ever been able to determine, was a combination of things that all added up to the same conclusion in people's minds. She was difficult. She was big, not in the soft, full-figured way that the frontier considered its own kind of beauty, but substantial, broad-shouldered, with large hands and a way of taking up space that made some people uncomfortable. She'd worked her own land for 6 years without help, and it showed in her posture and her calluses, and the particular set of her jaw that came from years of solving problems alone. She didn't talk the way women in Blackthorn Crossing were expected to talk: deferential, light, circling carefully around any subject that might cause discomfort. She said what she meant. Sometimes she said it before she'd fully thought through whether she should. And then there was the other thing, the thing that had started as a rumor and calcified over the years into something people treated as established fact, that she was bad luck, that Thomas had died because of her, that her land yielded poorly because of some quality in her, that any man foolish enough to get too close would find himself worse off for the trouble. She knew where that particular piece of folklore had started. It had started with Clara Hughes, whose husband had briefly courted Mara about 2 years after Thomas died, before thinking better of it and marrying Clara instead. Clara had never quite forgiven either of them for the interim period, even though nothing had actually happened. The rumor had grown from there, the way rumors do, fed by anyone who had a reason to want Mara smaller, further away, less present. The harvest gathering happened every year in the last week of September. It was partly a celebration of the season and partly a practical affair. The town's single men and the town's single women were expected to participate in the matching ceremony, a frontier tradition that had evolved from genuine necessity into something more like theater. The eligible bachelors made their selections from among the gathered women. Families watched. Offers were made, considered, accepted, or declined. Mara had stopped participating officially 3 years ago. She stood at the back instead and watched. The square had filled up by mid-morning. She could see the Belmont family arranged in a neat cluster near the platform. 3 daughters in pressed cotton dresses, their mother fussing with hair ribbons, their father standing with his thumbs in his vest pockets, looking satisfied with life. The Aldrich brothers were near the water trough with a group of other young men, loud and self-congratulatory in the way of people who'd never had reason to doubt their own welcome. Mayor Holt stood on the platform in his good coat, prepared to officiate the day's proceedings with the solemn authority he brought to everything, whether it deserved solemnity or not. Mara watched all of it from her spot near the assay office wall. She had a canvas bag over her shoulder with a few things she needed from the mercantile: salt, a new hinge for the chicken coop door, some lengths of rope. She'd attend the morning ceremony because it would look deliberate if she didn't, and then she'd collect her supplies and go home. She'd gotten good at not wanting things, or at least at not letting herself think too clearly about what she wanted. The ceremony began. Mayor Holt welcomed everyone with the usual speech about community and abundance and the promise of the land. The women eligible for matching were invited to stand near the platform. Mara stayed where she was. A few people noticed and elbowed each other, and she felt their glances without looking directly at any of them. The first matches proceeded without incident. James Aldrich chose Helen Pryor, to nobody's surprise. Two of the Belmont daughters received offers and accepted them with appropriate blushes. The crowd was warm and celebratory, the way crowds always are when things are going according to the script. Then Delbert Marsh got up on the platform, and Mara felt the particular shift in the crowd that preceded something unpleasant. Delbert Marsh was 35, a failed farmer turned part-time freighter, and he had the particular swagger of a man who'd been told his opinions mattered slightly more than they actually did. He scanned the women near the platform, made a show of deliberation, and then, with a grin that told Mara he'd planned this, he turned toward the back of the crowd. "What about Mara Vance?" he said, loudly enough that the whole square could hear. "She's still standing back there?" The laughter that followed was the worst kind. Not mean-spirited enough to be clearly wrong, just comfortable enough that people let themselves indulge in it. "Doesn't she want a husband?" someone called from the crowd. "Maybe she's waiting for someone desperate enough," another voice answered. Mara stood very still. She'd learned that stillness was better than movement in moments like this. Any movement could be read as retreat or as agitation, and she didn't want to give them either. "Come on, Mara," Delbert said, still grinning, turning it into entertainment for the crowd. "I'm right here. Any woman's better off than spending another winter alone." "Maybe she prefers the chickens," said Clara Hughes from somewhere off to Mara's left, and got the kind of polite laugh that meant half the crowd agreed. Mayor Holt said mildly, "Let's keep things orderly," which was not quite a rebuke of what was happening and not quite an endorsement of it either, and was therefore worse than either. Mara met Delbert's eyes across the square. She said nothing. She kept her face still. "Suit yourself," Delbert said, shrugging with theatrical disappointment, and turned back to the platform, and the crowd turned with him, the way water turns away from an obstacle without giving the obstacle much thought. She would leave now, Mara decided. She'd get her supplies from the mercantile, and she would not let herself think about any of this until she was on her land, where there was real work to do and the weight of other people's opinions couldn't quite reach her. She was starting to angle her way along the back of the crowd when it happened. She heard it before she understood it, a shift in the crowd's texture, a murmur that started somewhere near the north end of the square and moved through the gathered people like a wind through dry grass, turning heads, parting bodies. People stepped sideways without quite deciding to, the way crowds do when something large and uncertain is moving through them. Rourke Callahan walked into the square. Mara had seen him before. Everyone in Blackthorn Crossing had seen him. He came into town maybe 4 times a year to trade furs and resupply. And his appearances always created a particular kind of stillness in people, the way a very large animal moving at the edge of a clearing creates stillness. He was enormous, first of all. 6'4", maybe more, with the kind of breadth across the chest and shoulders that came from years of physical work in unforgiving country, not from any particular vanity. He wore buckskin and heavy wool, and his dark hair was longer than fashionable, and his beard was full and untrimmed, and there was nothing about him that suggested he'd ever spent a moment of his life caring what Blackthorn Crossing thought of him. He was maybe 35, 36, nobody knew exactly. Nobody knew much about him except that he ran a trapline deep in the Grey Wolf Mountains to the north, and that he was good at surviving things that killed other men, and that when he came into town to trade, he dealt fairly but didn't talk much, and he left as soon as his business was done. He was feared in the specific frontier way that is mostly respect wearing a cautious face. Men who had tried to cheat him in trades had found the experience educational. 2 years ago, a drifter had started trouble at the Dunmore Saloon when Rourke was there, and the drifter had found himself outside on the street so quickly and efficiently that several witnesses couldn't quite agree afterward on how it had happened. He moved through the crowd now, and the crowd led him, which it would. He didn't appear to notice the parting, or if he did, he didn't particularly care about it one way or the other. Mara watched him come and felt only a mild curiosity about what had brought him to the gathering. He never came to the gathering. He never came to any social event. She assumed he wanted something from the mercantile and had arrived at an inconvenient time. Rourke reached the edge of the cleared space in front of the platform and stopped. He looked at Mayor Holt on the platform with an expression that was not quite asking permission and not quite dismissing the proceedings, just acknowledging that they existed and that he was about to intersect with them. Mayor Holt, who was not entirely a foolish man, said, "Callahan," in a tone that was more greeting than anything else. Rourke nodded once. Then he turned and looked at the crowd, and his gaze moved through it with the same patient, systematic attention he probably gave to reading a terrain for signs of game or weather. And Mara watched his eyes move, and without understanding why, she felt the back of her neck go cold. His eyes stopped. They stopped on her. She was 50 feet away, half hidden behind the edge of the crowd, with her canvas bag over one shoulder and her face probably showing nothing except the careful blankness she'd learned to maintain in public. She had no reason to think he even knew who she was. They had never spoken. Rourke Callahan looked at Mara Vance for a long moment, and then he started walking toward her. The crowd parted again. People turned to watch without quite understanding what they were watching yet, which Mara could feel even if she couldn't see all their faces. She stayed still. She was aware of the absurdity of it, of the fact that she was standing here like something rooted to the earth, when any sensible person might have stepped aside or moved away or said something. He stopped in front of her, closer than most people ever stood to her these days, because most people made a point of leaving generous space around her, as if whatever unfortunate qualities she possessed might be communicable. He was very large at close range. She'd known that intellectually, but the reality of it was different. He smelled like wood smoke and pine pitch and cold air. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green, the color of lichen on granite, and they were looking at her with a directness that she hadn't experienced in years. Not the directness of appraisal or judgment, but something more level than that. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at everything, as a thing that existed, that was worth understanding, that deserved honest attention. "I need a partner," he said. His voice was low, roughened by weather and disuse, and he didn't appear to feel any need to build up to the statement. Someone capable, someone who knows hard work and won't pretend it's something else. Mara stared at him. Around them, the square had gone very quiet. She could feel 300 eyes on her back. "I know who you are," Rourke said. "I've watched you work. Last spring, you fixed the east drainage ditch on your property alone. Took you 4 days. Most men would have needed 2 hands and given up anyway." A pause. "I don't need easy. I need someone who finishes what she starts." She realized she should say something. She also realized that her mouth had gone somewhat dry. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "Not yet." She heard the murmur spreading through the crowd behind her, confused, half amused, skeptical. She heard Clara Hughes say something to the woman next to her, not loudly enough to make out words, but with a tone that didn't require words. She heard Delbert Marsh make a sound that was supposed to be a laugh, but came out strangled. She looked at Rourke Callahan and tried to find the angle, the joke, the humiliation waiting at the end of this. Because in her experience, public attention directed at her always had an ending like that. She couldn't find it. His face didn't have the right shape for cruelty. It was too still, too absent of anything performing. "Why?" she said. He seemed to consider the question seriously, which surprised her. "I've been up in those mountains for 11 years, he said. "I built a homestead up there that's worth building on. But one person, alone, there's things you can't manage alone, weather bad enough, injury, any number of things." He paused again. "I'm not looking for decoration. I'm looking for a partner, someone who can carry half." And you decided on me. I decided on you. She was aware of how strange this was. She was aware of the crowd. She was aware that whatever she said next would be discussed in Blackthorn Crossing for months, possibly years, and that she had no good options. Say no, and it was just another piece in the story they already told about her. Say yes, and she had no idea what she was agreeing to. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her land, the land she'd been working alone for 6 years, the land whose yield had been slowly declining because there were only so many hours in a day and only so many things one person could manage. She thought about the winter coming, and the chicken coop that needed more than a new hinge, and the fence posts on the east pasture that were going to give out by spring. She thought about Delbert Marsh's grin and the particular texture of that laughter. She thought about 8 years of that. "All right," she said. The silence in the square lasted about 3 seconds. Then it broke into noise all at once. Her name was Mara Ellison before she became Mara Vance, and she'd come to Blackthorn Crossing at 23 with Thomas, who'd had prospects and a plan and the kind of optimism that the frontier either confirms or destroys quickly. Thomas had been good-natured and not particularly good at farming, and he died before the land could really teach him what he needed to know. Mara had stayed because she had nowhere better to go, and because the land itself felt like hers by the time it finished taking everything else. She'd grown up in Missouri, the oldest daughter of a river trader who worked the Mississippi corridor and was mostly absent, and a mother who had managed an extraordinary amount with very little and made it look like nothing. Mara had her mother's capability and her father's stubbornness, and she'd never figured out whether that combination was an asset or a liability. It tended to depend on who was doing the accounting. The thing about growing up the way she had, watching her mother maintain a household and 4 children on the money that came sporadically down the river, was that it gave her a certain clarity about what was real and what was performance. She had no patience for performance. She could recognize it from a great distance. It was possible that this particular quality, more than anything else, was what made people in Blackthorn Crossing uncomfortable. Most social life was performance, and Mara had a face that didn't quite know how to pretend she didn't see it. She spent the rest of the harvest gathering morning at the back of the crowd, waiting for the ceremony to finish so she could access the mercantile without pushing through a wall of people who all had opinions about what had just happened. Rourke had moved to the side of the square and appeared to be waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to large quantities of it, taking up space without demanding attention, not talking to anyone in particular. People talked to her, or at her mostly. Several women she barely knew stopped to ask questions that were really just different shapes of the same question. "Are you seriously doing this? What is wrong with you? Don't you understand what you'd be getting into?" Agnes Weller, who ran the seamstress shop and had always been moderately kind, caught her arm and said, low-voiced, "Mara, you know nothing about that man." "I know what he told me," Mara said. "Which was what? That he needs someone to cook and keep house up in the wilderness? He said he needed a partner who could carry half." Agnes looked at her for a moment. "That could mean anything." "Yes," Mara agreed. "It could." She thought about that, honestly. She thought about the ways this could go wrong, which were numerous and not difficult to imagine. She thought about the fact that she'd agreed to something in the span of 3 minutes with a man she'd never spoken to before, in front of half the town, under social pressure she was too stubborn to call social pressure. That was not, by any reasonable measure, careful decision-making. But she also thought about her land. The homestead she couldn't sustain alone much longer. The way the winters had gotten longer and harder to manage by herself. The way there were entire categories of work that required 2 people, and she'd been doing them alone for 6 years through sheer bloody-minded refusal to admit it couldn't be done. She thought about the morning, about Delbert Marsh's grin, about the weight of 8 years of that particular kind of visibility, present enough to be mocked, invisible enough that mockery felt safe. She was 31 years old, and she was tired in a specific way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. The mercantile was crowded when she finally made it there, full of people buying supplies and conducting the ongoing social negotiation of a small settlement, and she could feel the shift in the air when she walked in, conversations that adjusted, eyes that found other things to look at. News traveled fast in Blackthorn Crossing. It always had. Harlan Webb was behind the counter, and he gave her a look that had something complicated in it, surprise and something she couldn't quite read. "Mara," he said, "you settling up your account before you head out?" She blinked. "I need salt and a hinge and some rope." "Right," he said, and went to gather the items. And when he came back, he said, as if the two subjects weren't connected, "Callahan's been coming here 11 years. Never done anything at the gathering before. Never so much as looked twice at any woman in town." "Is that so?" Mara said. "Just saying," Harlan said. "I'm not saying anything against it. I'm just saying it's not what anyone expected." "What did they expect?" He seemed to think about this honestly. "That you'd be alone," he said quietly, and then appeared to feel he'd said something either too honest or too unkind, because he looked away. She paid for her supplies. She didn't answer him. Well, Rourke was waiting near the livery when she came out of the mercantile. She hadn't been sure he would be. She'd half expected the whole thing to dissolve the way strange moments sometimes do, revealing itself as a misunderstanding or a brief lapse in someone's judgment. But he was there, leaning against the fence post with his arms folded, watching the street with the same even attention he appeared to give everything. "I need to arrange some things," she said, "before I go anywhere." "All right," he said. "My land, my cattle, I've got 4 head. I'll need to make arrangements for someone to keep the property until I know—" She stopped and reshaped the sentence. "Until we decide what we're doing." He nodded. No comment on the hedge in that. No comment on anything. "How far up is your homestead?" 2 days' ride in summer," he said. 3 if the weather's bad. 4 in winter, depending. "What do you have up there?" "Cabin, barn, about 2 acres cleared for kitchen garden. Another 3 I've been working on. Smokehouse, root cellar, though it needs shoring up on the north side. Spring house. Creek runs about 30 yards east." He said it the way someone recites a list they've recited before. Not flat, but efficient, like a man who doesn't see the point of adding decoration to facts. Mara stood on the boardwalk with her canvas bag and considered this. "How long have you been building it?" 11 years? Alone?" "Mostly." He paused. "Had a partner the first 3 years. He went back east." She filed that away. She had approximately 800 questions she was not going to ask standing on the main street of Blackthorn Crossing with half the town available to observe her. "Give me a week," she said. "I need to sort out my land and pack what I need and make sure the Hendersons will look after the cattle. My cow's in calf. She'll need watching." He nodded again. "I'll resupply and wait." "Where are you staying?" "I camp," he said, as if this were obvious, which maybe it was. She looked at him. He looked at her. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was not an uncomfortable one either. It was a silence with a kind of weight to it, the weight of 2 people who had just agreed to something large and were both looking at the size of it honestly. "I want it clear," she said, "what we're agreeing to before anything else happens." "Good," he said. "Just that." "You said partner. I want to know what that means." "It means equal say in what gets built and how," he said. "Equal share of what it produces. Equal say in decisions." He held her gaze. "I don't want someone to cook for me. I can cook. I want someone who can look at a problem and solve it and tell me when I'm wrong about something." She studied his face. "And if I disagree with you, then say so." Something that might have been dry amusement moved across his face, there and gone. "Loudly, if needed. I can take it." She almost said something sharp and decided against it. There would be time for learning the shape of each other's stubbornness. That, more than anything, was what the next weeks and months would be made of. "All right," she said. 1 week. 1 week? He agreed. She walked away down the boardwalk. She did not look back. She was aware of him watching her go, and she was aware of approximately 7 people watching from various positions along the street. And she was aware of the conversation that was probably already happening in Clara Hughes' kitchen and in the back room of the mercantile and on the front porch of the Aldrich property. She was also aware of something else, quieter than all of that. A small, stubborn, deeply suspicious thing at the back of her chest that might, under extreme provocation, be called hope. She pressed it down carefully. She'd learned the hard way what hope cost, and she wasn't in the business of paying that particular price without examining what she was buying first. The week was not peaceful. She'd expected difficulty, and she got it, but the shape of it surprised her in places. She'd assumed the gossip would be the hardest part. It wasn't. The gossip was just noise. It always had been, even when it cut. And she'd had 8 years to develop the particular kind of deaf ear that let her function in the presence of it. Clara Hughes sent 2 women she was friendly with to talk Mara out of it, and Mara listened to both of them with the attentive expression she'd developed for conversations she had no intention of being changed by, and sent them on their way. Harder was the practical sorting. The homestead she'd built with Thomas and then maintained alone. There was more of herself in it than she'd acknowledged. She walked through the rooms in the evenings and took a kind of inventory she hadn't taken before. What mattered enough to take, and what was just the accumulated weight of years spent in one place. The furniture was rough-made and wouldn't survive a 2-day mountain journey. The tools were different, the good ones, the ones she'd selected herself or repaired herself or learned the weight of until they were extensions of her hands. She packed methodically, clothes built for work, not appearance. Her mother's cast-iron skillet, which had come west with the family and was the most reliable object she'd ever owned. Seeds she'd been saving, the particular variety of bean that did well in high altitude, the squash that stored long. Her medical kit, such as it was, carbolic, clean cloth, the small glass vial of laudanum she'd kept locked up since Thomas's time and never used. A good knife. Her rifle, a Winchester she'd bought used 4 years ago and learned to shoot well enough that she was accurate at 300 yards on a calm day, less on a windy one. She went to see the Hendersons on the 3rd day. Old Per Henderson and his wife Britt ran the neighboring property and had been nothing but decent to her across the years, which made them more valuable than they knew. "I'd be grateful if you'd keep an eye on the cattle," she said. Per was nodding already before she finished the sentence. "Especially the red one. She's due in February." "We'll see to her," Britt said. She was a square, capable woman in her 60s with a way of saying things that made you believe them. "And the land. We'll check on the cabin." "I may be back by spring," Mara said. Britt looked at her steadily. "You may be," she agreed, in the tone of a person who has seen enough of life to know that maybe is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. "I'm not a fool," Mara said. "I know that," Britt said, without any particular inflection. "I've never thought you were." She didn't quite know what to do with that. It sat in her chest for the rest of the afternoon. On the 5th day, Delbert Marsh showed up. She was in the yard splitting wood when she heard him come through the gate, and she kept splitting until she'd finished the piece she was working on, because she was not going to let Delbert Marsh interrupt her rhythm. "Mara," he said. "Delbert." She set the maul down and turned. He was alone, which was slightly unusual for Delbert, who generally moved in the company of an audience. He looked not apologetic exactly, because that would have required a kind of self-examination she doubted Delbert had ever practiced. But something around the edges of his face was different than it had been in the square. "I want you to know," he said, "that what I said at the gathering, I didn't mean anything by it." She looked at him. She waited. "It was just talk," he said. "People laughing. You know how it is." "I know how it is," she said. He seemed to want her to say more than that, to offer him something that would make the conversation easier. She didn't. "Callahan, though," he said, and something came into his voice that was trying to sound like concern and sat in the wrong place for it. "You don't know what you're getting into. Man lives up there like an animal. Nobody knows what he does up in those mountains." "He traps," Mara said. "That's what he says." She picked up the maul again and set the next piece of wood on the block. "Is there something specific you're worried about? Or are you here to warn me about a thing you can't name because it doesn't exist?" Delbert's face reddened. "I'm trying to help." "You're trying to talk me out of something that embarrasses you," she said, not unkindly, just factually. "You made a joke at my expense in front of the whole town, and then a man twice your quality walked up and chose me, and that sits crooked with you. I understand it, but I don't need your help, Delbert. I never did." He stood in her yard for a moment longer, reddened and rearranging, and then he left without saying anything else. She split 3 more pieces before she allowed herself to notice that her hands had been steady the whole time. She was ready on the morning of the seventh day. Her pack was loaded, and her horse, a thick-legged bay named Red, who had been with her for 4 years and was uncomplaining about most things, was saddled and waiting in the yard. Rourke was at the gate when she came out with the last of her things. He had a mule loaded with his own supplies, and he looked at her pack with the assessing look of someone checking that a load is balanced and manageable. "You bring tools?" he said. "Yes." "Seeds?" "Yes." He nodded, satisfied, and turned to check his mule's cinch. Mara mounted Red and looked back at the cabin for a moment. 8 years of her life in that structure. Every repair she'd made herself, every winter she'd gotten through alone. Every morning she'd come out into the yard and decided, again, to keep going. It looked smaller from horseback than it did from inside. She turned Red toward the north road. "You're not going to look back?" Rourke said, coming up alongside her on a dark gray horse that looked built for mountain country. Short-coupled, deep-chested, with the placid eyes of an animal that had seen hard things and wasn't particularly impressed by them. "I just did," Mara said. He considered that. Then the ghost of that possible amusement crossed his face again, brief as weather, and they rode out of Blackthorn Crossing together in the early morning light, with the whole settlement available to watch if it wanted to. It did, mostly. She could feel it at her back like the sun coming up, warm with attention, indifferent to what it was warming. She didn't mind. She'd spent 8 years being watched and diminished by Blackthorn Crossing. She could survive being watched while she left it. The mountains waited to the north, dark and layered in the early light, running from gray to blue to something almost purple at the highest ridgelines, where the snow had already come and was already staying. They looked impossible from here. Most worthwhile things did. Mara Vance rode toward them and said nothing, and breathed the cold morning air and let herself feel, for the first time in a long time, the particular quality of a thing that was about to begin. The north road out of Blackthorn Crossing turned to trail inside of 4 miles, and the trail turned to something that was more suggestion than path inside of 8, and by the time the sun had climbed to mid-morning, Mara could no longer see anything behind her except trees and the pale gray strip of sky between them. Blackthorn Crossing had disappeared the way things do when the land swallows them, not dramatically, just gradually, until the absence was simply a fact. Rourke rode ahead of her for most of the morning. Not by much, maybe a horse length, and she understood it was practical rather than hierarchical. He knew the terrain, she didn't. Following was the sensible arrangement, and she was sensible enough not to make a principle out of something that wasn't one. He didn't talk much, which she'd expected. What she hadn't expected was that his silence had a different quality than most silences she'd experienced in company. It wasn't the silence of a person who had nothing to say or who was uncomfortable. It was the silence of a person who was paying attention to something other than conversation and who assumed you were capable of doing the same. She found, after the first hour, that she didn't mind it. She was busy herself, watching the terrain, reading the way the light fell through the trees, noting how the trail climbed and where the drainage ran, building the kind of mental map that came automatically to anyone who'd spent years managing land alone. By mid-afternoon, they'd gained enough elevation that her ears had adjusted twice, and the timber around them had changed from the mixed hardwood of the valley floor to a denser, darker stand of spruce and fir. The air was colder and had a particular quality to it, thinner, cleaner, with a bite underneath the smell of pine that told her winter was closer up here than it had been in the valley. They stopped at a stream crossing to water the horses. Rourke swung down and checked the mules' packs with the same systematic attention he seemed to apply to everything, pressing the canvas, testing the lashings, redistributing weight from one side to level an imbalance she hadn't noticed. Mara got down and let Red drink and stood watching the water move over the rocks. It was fast and very clear and cold enough that the edges were starting to skin over with ice where it slowed near the bank. "How much higher?" she said. "Another 1,000 feet tomorrow," he said, not looking up from the pack. "The cabin sits in a bench above the tree line on the east side. Good sight lines, hard to approach from below without being seen." She registered that as a deliberate feature, not just a convenience. "You built it that way on purpose." "Yes." She wanted to ask why, but there were enough possible reasons that she filed it for later. "Is there a trail the whole way?" until the last half mile. He straightened and looked at the mule, satisfied with the adjustment. There's a scramble section I can take you around. Adds about 20 minutes. Or straight up saves the time, but it's rough. Straight up, she said. He looked at her with that level attention. It's genuinely rough. I heard you the first time. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. He turned away and picked up his horse's reins. Straight up, then. They made camp that night in a hollow where a limestone outcropping broke the worst of the wind. Rourke built a fire with an efficiency that was almost reflexive. Not quick because he was hurrying, but quick because he'd done it so many times that the steps had reduced themselves to pure motion. Mara unsaddled the horses and rubbed them down and picketed them on a patch of dry grass at the edge of the hollow. And by the time she came back, he had water heating and was cutting dried meat into a small pot. She sat down across the fire from him. The sky above the tree line was extraordinarily clear, the stars bright and close at this elevation, in a way they never were down in the valley, where the smoke and dust of 200 people living in proximity softened everything. What happened to your partner? She said. The one who went back east. He stirred the pot. His wife wanted to come west, changed her mind when she got here. Can't say I blame her. First winter up there is brutal. He had to make a choice. He chose her? Yes. A pause. Good choice. I don't say it wasn't. She turned that over. But it left you alone. It left me alone, he agreed, without any particular weight of self-pity in it, just acknowledgement. The fire crackled. An owl called somewhere in the dark above them, once and then not again. Why me? She said. She'd asked it before in the square, and he'd answered something, but she wanted the fuller version, or whatever fuller version he was willing to give. There were other women in Blackthorn Crossing, younger ones, women whose families would have seen it as a good arrangement. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to redirect the question. Then he said, I came into town twice last year and once the spring before. I watched people. He looked across the fire at her. The way someone behaves when they think they're not being observed, that tells you most of what you need to know about them. I watched you fix that drainage ditch. I watched how you talked to Per Henderson. I watched you at the Mercantile when Harlan short-counted your change, and you caught it and told him, plain and without making a scene. He paused. You handle things. Quietly. Without performance. That's rarer than it sounds. She looked at him for a moment. You could have come and talked to me. I could have, he said. I thought about it. A brief pause. It seemed I didn't want you to feel pressured. In private, that kind of conversation, it's harder to refuse. She stared at him. So you did it in front of the whole town instead. He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. I didn't think through how it would look from your side. No, she said. You didn't. He nodded, accepting it. She looked at the fire. It was still better than what Delbert Marsh was doing. That's a low bar. Yes, she said. It is. She was quiet for a moment. But it's the one I've been living with for 8 years, so. He didn't say anything to that. He served the stew into 2 tin cups and handed one across the fire, and she took it, and they ate in the good silence of people who have said something true and don't need to add to it. The scramble section was, as advertised, genuinely rough. It was a 40-degree slope of broken shale and loose granite, cut with narrow ledges and interrupted by a band of exposed rock face about 30 feet across that required using both hands and picking foot placements carefully. Rourke went first with the mule on a lead and made it look easier than it was, and then came back down to take Red's lead while Mara climbed free, which she hadn't asked him to do but found she didn't resent. She made it up without incident, but not without effort. Her thighs were burning by the top, and she'd scraped the heel of her left hand on the rock face, and her lungs were working harder than she liked to admit at this elevation. She stood at the top and breathed and didn't say anything about any of that. Rourke handed Red's lead back. His expression was not impressed exactly, more like he'd registered something and filed it without making a comment out of it. How much further? She said. 20 minutes. It was 25, but she wasn't counting. The homestead came into view when they crested the last rise, and Mara stopped Red without quite deciding to, because the sight of it hit her differently than she'd expected. She'd built a picture in her head on the ride up. Rough, she'd told herself. Minimal. A man's house, which meant functional and probably cheerless, with the kind of corners that had been cut because there'd been no one to notice them. She'd been preparing to lower her expectations the whole ride up without admitting she was doing it. The cabin was rough. She hadn't been wrong about that. The logs were hand-hewn, and the chinking between them was patched in several places with different materials at different times, and the roof had a low, practical pitch that looked less like architecture and more like surrender to snow load. The yard around it was dirt, not grass, packed hard and practical. But it was solid in a way that read immediately and honestly. The logs were fitted well yet, not perfectly but carefully, with the kind of attention that meant they'd been seated correctly and would hold. The door was hung true. The barn was smaller than the cabin, but built the same way, the same care in the bones of it. There were raised beds along the south wall, empty now, with the remnants of dead vegetation still in them that told her someone had grown things there with intention. The woodpile under the lean-to at the east end of the cabin was stacked straight and high and dry. 11 years of work. She looked at it and understood for the first time, really understood, what he'd been building up here alone. "It's not finished," Rourke said, coming up beside her. She heard something careful in his voice. Not defensiveness, but something adjacent to it. The voice of someone who has looked at what they've built for so long that they mostly see what's missing. "Nothing worth building is ever finished," she said. He looked at her. Then he looked at the homestead. "No," he said. "I suppose not." The first 3 weeks were the hardest thing she'd done since the winter Thomas died. Not because of Rourke. That at least was less difficult than she'd anticipated. He was consistent in the way of people who'd spent years with only themselves for company and had therefore developed clear habits and clear expectations of those habits. He woke before dawn. He worked without complaint and without needing to be asked about most things. He was direct when he had something to say and quiet when he didn't, and the directness, while occasionally blunt enough to require adjustment, was at least honest. She never had to parse what he actually meant from what he'd said, which was something she'd spent 8 years doing in Blackthorn Crossing and found she didn't miss. The work itself was what nearly broke her. She'd thought she understood hard labor. She'd been managing a homestead alone for 6 years. She had calluses on her hands and the kind of practical competence that came from having no choice but to develop it. She hadn't been soft in years. But the mountain was a different category of difficult. The elevation meant that any exertion cost more. Her body needed 2 weeks to begin adjusting to the thinner air, and in those 2 weeks, even ordinary work left her breathless in a way that felt humiliating, like her lungs had become strangers. The cold came faster than it did in the valley and went deeper, and the wind on the exposed bench where the homestead sat came out of the northwest with a conviction that was almost personal. She'd brought good wool and good boots, but the first week she lay awake 2 nights with cold feet despite being inside, until she figured out that the floor in the sleeping area had a gap at the base of the north wall that funneled cold air in, and she packed it with clay from the creek bank. Rourke hadn't mentioned the gap. When she told him she'd fixed it, he looked briefly unsettled in a way she couldn't immediately account for. "I've been meaning to get to that," he said. "It's done now," she said. He nodded, and she watched him work through something behind his eyes that he didn't give words to, and she understood it eventually as the particular adjustment of a person who'd been doing things their own way for 11 years, encountering someone who just did things differently and not worse. It wasn't resentment. It was recalibration. She recognized it because she was going through the same thing from the other direction. They argued for the first time at the end of the second week about the root cellar. He'd said he planned to shore up the north wall before the hard freeze set in. She'd looked at the north wall and agreed it needed shoring, but she'd also looked at the drainage situation and concluded that the more urgent problem was the water infiltration at the base of the west wall, which was going to undermine the whole structure before spring if it wasn't addressed first. "The north wall goes," he said. "The whole roof section could shift." "The north wall isn't going anywhere before February," she said. "The drainage problem goes untreated. You'll have standing water in there by November. I've been watching this cellar for 3 years. I know which problem is worse." You've been watching it from inside, she said. I looked at the grade of the slope from outside. Water coming off the hillside is running straight at the base of that west wall. I can show you the line if you want. He was quiet for a moment. Show me. She showed him. He stood at the base of the slope and looked at the runoff line she was pointing at and was quiet for another moment. Both, he said finally. We do the drainage this week and the wall shoring next. Yes, she said. They did both. The drainage took 2.5 days, digging a diversion trench above the cellar and lining it with flat stones from the creek. And it was miserable work in the cold, with mud that froze overnight and had to be broken up again each morning. She was sore for a week afterward in muscles she'd forgotten she had. But the cellar was dry, and the north wall was shored up before the first hard freeze came down off the mountain at the end of October and locked everything in. She felt, after that, something settle between them. Not comfort, not yet, but a kind of practical acknowledgement. Two people who had separately figured out how to survive things and were now, cautiously, figuring out how to survive things together. It was less graceful than it sounded. There were days when his silences felt impenetrable and she resented them. There were probably days when her directness landed wrong and she didn't know it. There were evenings when they sat by the fire and the distance between them felt enormous and unnavigable, and she lay awake afterward wondering what she'd agreed to and whether it made any sense. And then there were other evenings. He'd started talking more, in the way of someone who'd stopped expecting conversation and was now, cautiously, like a man testing ice, discovering he didn't mind it. He told her things about the mountains in the particular way of someone who'd lived in close observation of a place for years, where the elk wintered and why, which ridgelines held snow longest and which shed it fast, the way the creek changed character between seasons, full and raucous in snowmelt, and quieter and stranger in the August dry. He told her which plants he'd learned to use for various problems, and she told him things she knew from her mother that he didn't, about preservation, about storage, about the particular properties of plants she'd grown up using in Missouri that didn't grow up here but had mountain equivalents he hadn't identified. How did your mother know all that? He asked one evening, maybe a month in. She had to, Mara said. My father was gone most of the time. She ran everything. 4 children, a house, the accounts, the garden, the animals. She couldn't afford to not know things. Sounds like a capable woman. She was the most capable person I've ever known, Mara said. She also wore herself out before she was 50. She paused. I spent a lot of years thinking I didn't want to be like her. Turns out I am, mostly, just angrier about it. Rourke looked at her across the fire. Being angry about something doesn't mean you're wrong about it, he said. She turned that over. No, she agreed. It doesn't. The fire settled. Outside, the wind was picking up against the north wall, making its presence known. She could hear the horses moving in the barn, the comfortable shift of large animals at rest. She thought about Blackthorn Crossing, about Clara Hughes and Delbert Marsh, and all the accumulated weight of 8 years of other people's opinions about what she was. Up here, none of that reached. The mountain was indifferent to her history. It would kill her just as quickly as it would kill anyone else, and shelter her just as readily if she paid attention to what it asked. There was something almost restful in that indifference. It was the most honest accounting she'd encountered in years. She was not happy, exactly. She was not sure she knew what that would feel like anymore, or whether it was a reasonable thing to expect from life. But she was here, and she was useful, and the work she did had immediate and visible consequences. And when she looked at the shored-up north wall of the root cellar or the dry floor inside it, she felt a particular kind of solid satisfaction that was perhaps not so far from happiness after all. It was enough. For now, it was enough. And the mountain was not finished with her yet. The first snow of the season came in the second week of November, and it came the way serious weather always comes to the high country. Not gradually, not with warning enough to matter, but all at once, as if the mountain had been holding it back and simply let go. Mara woke to a world that had been remade overnight. 18 inches on the flat ground, more where it had drifted against the barn and the north wall of the cabin, the entire bench smoothed into unfamiliar shapes that required learning again. She and Rourke spent the first day of it digging out, not panicking, not complaining, just working through the list of things that needed doing in order of what would cause the most damage if left undone. The barn roof first, clearing the load before it stressed the beams. Then the path to the woodpile. Then the spring house. They moved around each other in the yard with the efficiency of people who had, over the past 6 weeks, learned each other's rhythms without making a ceremony of it. By December, she understood what he had meant when he said the first winter was brutal. It wasn't dramatic. It was relentless. The cold settled into the homestead the way it settles into high mountain country. It became the baseline condition of everything, the fact against which all other facts were measured. The water in the basin froze by morning if she didn't bank the stove right. The animals needed more feed and more attention in cold that deep. Going outside required intention and preparation that took longer than the task it preceded, some days. But they were ready for it, mostly. The root cellar was full and dry. The woodpile was enormous. Rourke had been cutting and splitting since August, and she'd joined the effort in October, and between them they'd stacked what she estimated was a winter and a half's worth of fuel under the lean-to. The barn was banked with straw bales on the north and west sides. She'd put up enough preserved food in September and October that the shelves in the cellar were crowded with it, jars and crocks, and smoked meat and dried beans, and the particular satisfaction of a larder that could sustain them. They were managing. She held on to that on the days when managing felt like the most that could be said. It was in the deep stillness of a January morning when the temperature had dropped low enough that the trees were cracking in the cold, like distant rifle shots, that Rourke came in from checking the trapline with news that changed the shape of everything. He came in stamping snow off his boots and pulled his coat off and stood by the stove longer than he usually did, warming his hands, and something in the set of his shoulders told her before he spoke that whatever he'd seen out there wasn't about the trapline. "There were men on the South Ridge," he said. "3 of them, not hunters." She looked up from the bread she was working. "How do you know?" "Hunters read the terrain. These men were reading the homestead." He paused. "They had a surveyor's rod." The words sat in the room between them for a moment. Mara knew enough about frontier land politics to know what a surveyor's rod meant in the wrong hands. It meant someone was building a case for something, mapping what existed, establishing a record that could be used later. "Did they see you?" she said. "No, I came around through the east draw." "Who do you think sent them?" He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet she heard him deciding how much to say and deciding to say it. "There's been talk," he said. "I heard it when I was in Blackthorn Crossing last spring. A man named Gideon Pike. He's been buying land in the valley. Not from the families, from the territory office. Claims on land, he says, isn't properly filed or has expired registrations." "And your claim," she said, "filed in 71. Renewed proper." He turned from the stove. "But Pike's got lawyers, that's what I heard. Men who find irregularities in filings that were fine when they were made." She set the bread dough down. "You've known about this since last spring." "It was talk," he said. "Men with money talking about land they want. I've heard that before and it came to nothing." "But you chose this winter to take on a partner," she said, not accusingly. She was thinking aloud, putting things together. He met her eyes. "Yes." She sat down on the bench by the table. She thought about what he'd said in the square. "I need a partner, someone capable." And she thought about the fact that he was not a man given to impulsive decisions, that 11 years of solitary work in the high country tended to produce the opposite of impulsiveness. He'd had reasons. Multiple reasons, probably, layered the way his decisions seemed generally to be layered. "You should have told me about Pike before now," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have." She appreciated that he didn't argue it. "Tell me everything you know." Gideon Pike had come to the Blackthorn Crossing territory 18 months ago, arriving from the east with enough money to buy the old Dunmore property outright and enough legal documentation to make the purchase look routine. He was, by the accounts Rourke had gathered across 2 seasons of careful listening in town, a man of approximately 45 who dressed well and spoke well and had the practiced pleasantness of someone who'd learned that people trusted a pleasant face more than they should. He had a particular interest in the mountain valley that sat above Blackthorn Crossing, the bench land and the high meadows, and the creek systems that fed the valley floor. The reason, as best as Rourke had pieced it together, was timber. The high country above the settlement was dense with old-growth fir and spruce, the kind of timber that Eastern Railroad companies paid serious money for, and the man who controlled access to those slopes stood to profit enormously. Rourke's homestead sat at the primary access point. The trail that connected the valley to the high meadows passed directly through his claimed land. Without that corridor, the timber operation Pike apparently envisioned would require building a new route from scratch. Expensive, slow, possibly impossible given the terrain. "He needs you gone," Mara said. "He needs the land," Rourke said. "I'm just the obstacle." "That's the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. "Where are your claim documents?" He crossed to the cabin's back wall and pulled a flat tin box from the high shelf above the fireplace. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, were papers she could see were old and handled, but intact. She spread them on the table and read them carefully. She'd seen land documents before, had handled Thomas's filing herself, knew what the language was supposed to look like, and what the important dates and signatures were. The claim was solid, filed properly, renewed properly, signed by 2 territorial witnesses, and registered with the land office in Callaway, the county seat 2 days' ride south of Blackthorn Crossing. The description of the parcel boundaries was specific and accurate. She could tell from what she'd seen of the terrain in the months since arriving. "These are good," she said. "A competent lawyer looks at these. There's nothing to challenge." "Pike's lawyers aren't looking for something to challenge," Rourke said. "They're looking for something to manufacture." She looked up at him. He said it without particular emotion, just flatly, as a thing he'd come to understand about the way the world operated for men with sufficient money. "Then we need someone in Callaway," she said. "Someone who knows the land office. Someone who can watch for any filings that touch your claim." "I know a man," Rourke said. "Emmett Gore. He's a land agent, not a lawyer, but he's honest, and he's been in that office for 15 years. He knows where the bodies are buried, so to speak." "Write to him," Mara said. "Already did, in November, before the snow closed the trail." He paused. "Haven't had an answer yet." She nodded. The letter would take weeks in either direction in winter, and that was assuming the post-rider was making the mountain route at all in this weather, which was not guaranteed. The surveyors on the South Ridge were the more immediate problem. They were evidence that Pike wasn't waiting for spring. What? She saw Pike herself for the first time in February, and not under circumstances she would have chosen. They'd made the difficult decision to ride down to Blackthorn Crossing to check on her cattle. The red cow had been due in February, and she'd been worrying about it since January, more than she wanted to admit, because the animal was old and the calf was her only significant livestock asset, and if something went wrong, Per Henderson was good-hearted, but not particularly experienced with difficult calving. The ride down took most of a day in the winter conditions, slow and careful on the trail, Rourke breaking trail ahead on the gray horse. Blackthorn Crossing in February was gray and contracted, everyone keeping mostly to their structures and coming out only for necessities. The streets were tramped down to dirty ice. The mercantile was warm and smelled of wood smoke and damp wool, and the particular closeness of a small space that had been occupied by a lot of cold people all winter. Per Henderson met them at his gate and told her the calf had come 3 weeks ago, a heifer, both doing fine. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized had been tight. It was at the mercantile afterward that she saw Pike. He was at the counter talking to Harlan Webb when they came in, and Mara registered him immediately the way you register something that doesn't quite fit the usual picture of a place. Too well dressed for the season, coat too clean, the kind of careful grooming that required either a great deal of money or a great deal of vanity or both. He was a lean man, smooth-faced for his age, with pale eyes that moved quickly and a way of standing at the counter as if he owned it. He looked at Rourke first, then at her. The assessment in his eyes was fast and practiced. She saw it and recognized it for what it was, the rapid calculation of a man who is accustomed to identifying vulnerabilities. "Callahan," he said, with the warmth of a man who has decided warmth is the right tool for the moment. "I've been meaning to get up to meet you properly. I'm Gideon Pike." "I know who you are," Rourke said. Pike's smile didn't move, which told Mara more than a changed expression would have. "I hope you've heard good things." He looked at Mara again. "And this must be Mrs. Callahan." "Mara Vance," she said. "Of course." The smile again, recalibrated. I understand you've made quite a home up on the bench. I have some interest in that part of the valley, actually. I'd love to discuss the land situation with you both sometime. I think there may be opportunities to— We're not interested, Rourke said. You haven't heard what I'm suggesting. You've had men on my South Ridge with surveying equipment, Rourke said. I know what you're suggesting. Something shifted behind Pike's pale eyes. Not quite displeasure, something cooler than that. The look of a man who has recalculated and found the calculation unchanged. Those men were mapping the public land adjacent to your claim, he said. Entirely within my rights. Adjacent, Rourke said. That's right. A pause, and then Pike looked at Mara with the particular attention of a man who has decided to try a different angle. Mrs. Vance, I understand you have property in the valley as well, homestead on the south end of Blackthorn Creek. I might be interested in making an offer if you're— My property isn't for sale, she said, and neither is his. Everything has a price, Pike said pleasantly. Not everything, she said, and not everyone. They looked at each other for a moment. She held his gaze without difficulty, because she'd been holding the gaze of men who underestimated her for most of her adult life, and she was very good at it. Pike smiled one more time and nodded and picked up his parcel from the counter and left the mercantile with the ease of a man who is not accustomed to concerning himself with people who tell him no. Harlan Webb watched him go and then looked at them both. He's been in here 3 times this winter, he said quietly, asking questions about the land up above. Which families own what? When their claims were filed. He paused. I don't know what he's planning, but I don't like the feeling of it. He's planning to own the mountain, Mara said, or enough of it to make everyone else's ownership useless. The letter from Emmett Gore arrived in the 3rd week of February, carried up from town by a post rider who nearly hadn't made the trail. Mara was in the barn when Rourke brought it in from outside, and she read it over his shoulder by the light from the barn door. Gore's handwriting was cramped and certain, the handwriting of a man who wrote a lot and had stopped caring whether it was attractive. What he'd written was precise and not comforting. Pike had filed a request with the Territorial Land Office to review historical claims in the Upper Valley. The request cited a provision in the Territorial Code that allowed for review of claims made before 1875 under a newer registration standard. The review was not, on its face, a challenge. It was framed as administrative housekeeping. But Gore had seen this maneuver before, and what followed administrative review was typically a finding of technical non-compliance, and what followed that was a grace period to refile under the new standard, and what followed that was a higher fee and a longer process, and the kinds of delays during which men with money and lawyers could make counterfilings that clouded the record. It wasn't stealing the land directly. It was making the land's ownership uncertain enough that it became easier to sell than to fight. Rourke read the letter twice. His face was still, which she'd learned meant he was working through something carefully, rather than that he had nothing to feel about it. He's going after the Henley property too, she said, pointing to the relevant section. And the Marsh family's upper pasture claim. She paused. He's not just coming for you. He's coming for the whole Upper Valley. All at once, Rourke said. So we're each dealing with our own problem and nobody's talking to anybody else about it. Until now, Mara said. He looked at her. Right back to Gore, she said. Ask him to document every filing Pike's made in the last 18 months. Dates, amounts, the attorneys of record, everything. She folded the letter carefully. And we need to talk to the Henleys, and the Marshes, and anyone else whose land sits in that Upper Valley corridor. That means going back down to Blackthorn Crossing, he said. Twice, maybe more. Yes, she said, it does. She could see him calculating the trail conditions, the risk, the time away from the homestead in the hardest part of winter. She watched him weigh it and arrive where she'd already arrived. The Henleys are good people, he said finally. They'll listen. The question is whether they'll act, she said. That's always the question. Outside, the wind was coming hard off the north ridge, pushing snow in long curtains across the bench, erasing the yard's familiar shapes again. The mountain was indifferent, as it had always been. It would freeze Pike's surveyors just as readily as it would freeze them. That was the only democracy the high country offered. But indifference wasn't protection, and Mara had learned a long time ago that waiting for the mountain to solve human problems was the same as not solving them. She refolded the letter and put it in the tin box with the claim documents. The box went back on the high shelf. They had work to do, and the cold wasn't going to excuse them from it. Getting down to Blackthorn Crossing in late February was not a matter of deciding to go and going. It was a matter of watching the weather for 3 days until a window opened. 2 days of clear sky between storms, which was the most the mountain offered and had to be enough. They left before first light on the first clear morning, and Mara spent most of the ride down thinking about how to say what needed saying to people who had spent the better part of a decade deciding she wasn't worth listening to. That was the problem she hadn't fully worked through yet. Rourke could talk to the Henleys and the Marsh family and whoever else held land in the Upper Valley corridor. He was known, he was respected, and his word carried the weight of 11 years of honest dealing. But the strategy she was building in her head, the one that would actually work against Pike's legal maneuvering, required more than a few neighbors agreeing that something was wrong. It required documentation, coordination, and a collective filing that would make the Territorial Land Office's review process significantly more complicated than Pike had planned for. That was her territory. Or rather, it was the territory her particular combination of stubbornness and clear-eyed practicality had been preparing her for without her knowing it. She'd handled Thomas's land documents, and then her own, and she'd dealt with the Territorial Filing Office twice when there were questions about her renewal. She understood the bureaucratic architecture of how land ownership was recorded and challenged and defended, and she understood, perhaps more importantly, that it was an architecture built by people, which meant it had the vulnerabilities of things built by people. Pike was exploiting one of those vulnerabilities. She intended to use a different one. The Henley property sat on the eastern edge of the Upper Valley, about a mile north of Blackthorn Crossing proper. Frank Henley was 60-something, a weathered, slow-spoken man who had homesteaded the property in 1869 and built everything on it with his own hands and the help of his 2 sons, who were grown now and running sections of the same land. His wife, Ruth, was the kind of woman who fed everyone who came to her door and remembered everything anyone had ever said in her presence, and was therefore considerably more dangerous than she appeared. They sat in the Henley kitchen, all 4 of them, plus Frank's older son, Cale, who'd come in from the barn when he saw riders coming. And Mara laid out what Gore's letter had said, and what it meant piece by piece, without softening it. Frank Henley listened with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and his face showing nothing in particular. Ruth listened with her eyes on Mara's face, which was a more active kind of listening. "He can do this," Cale said when she'd finished. He was 30, broad, and fair, with the same slow speech as his father. "Just file a review request, and that's enough to cloud the claim." "Not enough to take it," Mara said, "but enough to make the process expensive and slow. He's counting on the fact that most people will sell rather than fight a legal battle they can't afford." "How do we fight it?" Ruth said. Practical, direct, no preamble. "We file a collective counterpetition with the land office in Callaway," Mara said. "Every property holder in the Upper Valley corridor files together, with a consolidated record of their claims, original filings, renewal dates, witness signatures, continuous use documentation. We make the record so complete and so coordinated that any review process has to contend with all of us at once instead of picking us off separately." She paused. "And we request that the review be conducted by the Territorial Surveyor General's office rather than the local land office, which is where Pike has more influence." Ruth looked at her husband. Frank turned his coffee cup once in his hands. "You've done this kind of paperwork before?" he said, looking at Mara. "I've handled my own filings," she said, "and I know enough to know what we need and how to organize it. Emmett Gore in Callaway knows the rest." "Gore's a good man," Frank said, which from him appeared to constitute a significant endorsement. "Then you'll do it?" Rourke said. It was the first thing he'd said since they sat down, and Frank looked at him for a moment with the look of one man taking the measure of another's certainty. "I'll talk to the Marshes," Frank said, "and the Delacroix family up on the north section. If they're in, we're in." The Marsh family was a more complicated conversation. Hector Marsh, Delbert's older brother, and a fundamentally different kind of person, owned the upper pasture claim that Gore's letter had identified as another of Pike's targets. Hector was fair-minded and hard-working and had always been reasonably decent to Mara in the years she'd lived in the valley, which put him in a small category. But Delbert was at the property when they arrived, and Delbert was visibly uncomfortable from the moment Mara walked through the door in a way that had everything to do with the harvest gathering and whatever story he'd been telling about it since. She ignored him, which was the correct approach. Hector listened to the same summary she'd given the Henleys. He asked sharper questions than Frank. He was a faster thinker, more suspicious by temperament, which meant he needed more convincing but would be a stronger ally once convinced. "Why is Callahan's name on this claim review request?" he said, pointing at the relevant section of the letter. "He's the only one named specifically." "Because his land is the access corridor," Mara said. "Rourke's homestead is the bottleneck. Lose that, and the timber operation Pike is building toward can go through regardless of what any other family does. He's starting with the critical piece. And once he has the corridor, then every family in the Upper Valley is effectively landlocked from the high meadows," she said. "He can charge access fees, or he can make access so difficult that the land above the corridor loses most of its grazing value." She kept her voice even. "He doesn't need to own everything. He just needs to own the right thing." Hector looked at his brother, which was a mistake because Delbert took it as an invitation. "How do we know this isn't just Callahan trying to get everyone riled up over nothing?" Delbert said. "Or her." He said the last word with just enough emphasis to be unpleasant without being specific about it. Mara looked at him. "The letter is from Emmett Gore," she said. "You can write to him yourself and ask if it's real. The filing is public record at the Territorial Land Office. You can send someone to Callaway to verify it." She paused. "Or you can decide I'm making it up because you're embarrassed about the harvest gathering and lose your upper pasture in the spring." Hector made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He looked at his brother with an expression that said several things, none of them complimentary. "I'm in," Hector said. "Delbert, either help or stay out of the way." Delbert stayed out of the way, which was the best available outcome. What? By the time they rode back up to the homestead on the second afternoon, they had commitments from 4 families and a working plan. Mara wrote to Gore that evening with specifics: the list of properties, the documentation each family would need to compile, the precise language for the counter-petition request. She wrote it at the kitchen table by firelight with Rourke sitting across from her reading the draft sections she handed him and occasionally suggesting a change in language that was almost always correct. It was the most they'd talked in a sustained way about anything since the root cellar argument in October, and there was something in the quality of the conversation, 2 people thinking hard about the same problem from different angles and finding the angles complementary, that felt different from the careful, provisional partnership they'd been building across the winter. Less tentative, more like what he'd said in the square: equal say, equal share. She didn't remark on it. She sealed the letter and set it by the door for the next time someone was heading down to the Valley Post. March came in cold and stayed that way. They had 2 more storms, each one adding to the snowpack on the north-facing slopes in a way that Rourke said was going to mean a heavy snowmelt in April, which was information she filed away without yet knowing what to do with it. The answer from Gore arrived in the last week of March. He had registered their intention to file a counter-petition. He had spoken to an attorney in Callaway named Aldous Webb, no relation to Harlan, who handled territorial land cases and who was willing to take the consolidated filing on a deferred fee arrangement, meaning the families wouldn't pay unless the case succeeded. He had also found something in Pike's filing history that was, Gore wrote, of considerable interest. 2 of the properties Pike had already acquired in the valley, the Dunmore Place and a smaller parcel on the southwest edge, had been purchased using a shell company registered in a different territory under a different name. The purchases had been structured to avoid the territorial residency requirement for land acquisition, which was a provision designed to prevent exactly what Pike appeared to be doing: outside money buying up land in bulk, using legal entities that obscured the buyer's identity and intentions. It wasn't, Gore was careful to note, necessarily illegal in itself. But it was the kind of thing that territorial officials found embarrassing when it became public, because it made them look like they'd been either negligent or complicit, and territorial officials who were worried about looking complicit had a strong incentive to apply the rules very carefully to the person who'd made them look that way. Mara read that section 3 times. Then she looked up at Rourke. "We don't fight the review," she said. "We ask for it. Loudly. We request a full public review of all land acquisitions in the Upper Valley in the last 2 years, including Pike's. We welcome the scrutiny, and we invite the territorial office to scrutinize everything." He saw it immediately. "Turn his own weapon around." "He filed for a review to create uncertainty," she said. "We expand the review to include him. His shell company purchases, the residency question, all of it." She set the letter down. "He was counting on us being afraid of attention from the territorial office. We give them more attention than they expected, pointed at everything." Rourke was quiet for a moment. Outside, the late March wind was working at the cabin in a new way. Less of winter's blunt force, more of the unpredictable, changeable quality that meant the season was beginning to shift. "This works if the territorial office is honest," he said. "Gore thinks it is, at this level. And if Pike has people there? Then we make enough noise that the people above them notice," she said. "This goes to the newspapers if we need it to. There are 2 papers in Callaway and 1 in the capital. Shell company purchases, residency violations, coordinated claim challenges against family homesteaders." She stopped. "That's a story that writes itself." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this since February," he said. "Since January," she said, "since you told me about the surveyors." Something moved across his face that was more than the dry, near amusement she'd seen in the early months. It was something more like recognition. The particular look of a person who has discovered that someone they trusted was, in fact, worth trusting. She looked away before it could become a moment she didn't know what to do with. April brought the snowmelt Rourke had predicted, and it brought something else. 4 men on horseback who arrived at the homestead on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the flat white of unsettled weather and the temperature was dropping again after 3 days of false warmth. They weren't surveyors this time. They came up the South Trail openly, which was either confidence or a message, and they stopped at the edge of the yard and the one in front. A thick-necked man in a good coat who introduced himself as Hargrove without offering a first name, said they were there on behalf of a business interest to discuss the land situation. Rourke stood in the yard and listened. Mara stood at the cabin door and listened too, because the cabin door was where she'd positioned herself when she heard them coming, with a clear line of sight to the yard and her Winchester leaning against the doorframe within reach, but not in her hands. Hargrove did most of the talking. The business interest, he said, was prepared to offer a fair price for the Callahan claim. A very fair price, he emphasized, generous given current land values, and would additionally guarantee a lease arrangement if Callahan wanted to continue operating on the property, though under different terms. "No," Rourke said. Hargrove's pleasantness developed a texture. "Mr. Callahan, I'd encourage you to consider carefully. The land review process can be long and expensive, and there's no guarantee of how it resolves. The offer we're making represents a certainty that the review process doesn't." "My claim is solid," Rourke said. "The review doesn't concern me." "It might concern you more than you expect," Hargrove said, and the texture in his pleasantness sharpened into something that wasn't pleasant at all. "Things have a way of becoming complicated." "Are you threatening him?" Mara said from the door. Hargrove looked at her. The 3 men behind him looked at her, then at the Winchester, then distributed their attention more carefully. "I'm describing reality," Hargrove said. "Reality right now is that you're on private land without an invitation," she said, "and you've just made a statement that sounds like a threat in front of 2 witnesses, which is information that will be in a letter to Emmett Gore and Callaway before tonight." She kept her voice level. "You want to threaten us? Go ahead. We'll document it and it'll be part of the public record when this goes before the territorial office." A pause. "Or you can leave." Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Rourke. He looked at the Winchester. He left. The 3 men with him left too, in the way of men who have realized that the situation is not what they were told it would be and are not being paid enough for the difference. Rourke watched them go until they'd cleared the South Trail and disappeared into the trees. Then he turned and looked at her in the doorway. "You had that planned," he said. "I had it ready," she said. "There's a difference." He came across the yard toward her, and she stepped back from the door to let him in, and when he passed her in the doorway, he stopped and looked at her from close range with the same directness he'd looked at her with in the square, back in September, back when she'd had no idea who he was or what any of this would become. "Mara," he said. "Don't make it complicated," she said. "I'm not. I just want to say—" He stopped. He was not a man who found words quickly when the words mattered. She'd learned that about him. "I was right about you," he said finally. "Back in September. I was right." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about all the ways she could respond to that, deflect it, minimize it, turn it into something lighter and safer. She'd been doing versions of that her whole life, making herself easier for other people to be around by making herself smaller than she was. "I know," she said, and she didn't look away when she said it. Outside, the sky was doing something complicated. The flat white of it breaking up in the northwest, showing a darkness behind it that meant weather coming, real weather, not the tentative almost spring of the last few days. The mountain was making itself known again, the way it periodically did, reminding anyone who'd forgotten that they lived at its discretion. But inside the cabin, the stove was burning well, and the claim documents were in their tin box on the shelf, and Emmett Gore had their letter, and Aldous Webb had their case, and 4 families in the valley below were compiling their documentation, and Hargrove was riding back to Gideon Pike to explain that the woman at the door had not been what he'd expected. None of it was finished. Very little of it was certain. The counter-petition hadn't been filed yet, and the territorial office hadn't responded, and Pike was still in Blackthorn Crossing making his plans with the patience of a man who believed money was a more durable foundation than principle. But they were still on the homestead, and Mara was still here, and the work that mattered was still ahead of them, which was not a comfortable thing but was at least an honest one. And honesty, she had come to understand, was the only foundation that held in hard country. She put the Winchester back on its hooks above the door. She went to stir the stove. Behind her, she heard Rourke hang up his coat and sit down at the table, and the ordinary sound of it, the simple domestic fact of another person in the room, was something she was no longer trying not to feel grateful for. The counter-petition reached the Territorial Land Office in Callaway on the 14th of April, carried down by Rourke on a 3-day ride through mud and snowmelt that left both him and the gray horse looking like they'd fought something and mostly won. Aldous Webb had done his work carefully. The consolidated filing ran to 47 pages of documentation, claim records, witness statements, and a formal request for expanded review that named Pike's Shell Company purchases specifically and asked the Surveyor General's office to examine the residency question directly. Mara had written the cover letter herself. She'd written it 4 times before she was satisfied with it. Not because she wasn't sure what she wanted to say, but because the language had to be precise in a way that left no room for the territorial office to misread it as combative or frivolous. She wanted it to read as the straightforward request of reasonable people who had nothing to hide and every confidence in the process, which was a particular kind of tone that was harder to achieve than it sounded, especially when what you actually felt was a contained and deliberate fury at the situation and at the man who'd created it. Rourke came back from Callaway with 2 things: a receipt of filing from the land office and a piece of information from Emmett Gore that neither of them had expected. Pike had sold the Dunmore property. Not quietly. Not through intermediaries. He'd listed it openly with the Territorial Property Registry and accepted an offer within a week. Gore had heard through channels he described only as reliable that Pike had also begun withdrawing from 2 other land ventures in the territory, restructuring the same shell company, moving money in ways that suggested someone preparing an exit rather than an advance. He knew, Rourke said. He was sitting at the table with his coat still on, too tired from the ride to have taken it off yet. Before our petition even arrived, he knew it was coming. Mara stood at the stove and thought about that. Hargrove told him, she said, after we turned him away. He went back and told Pike that we'd documented the visit and were already in contact with Gore. Pike did the math. So he's retreating. He's retreating from this territory, she said. He'll find another one. She paused. Men like that don't stop. They just move. Rourke looked at her. Does that bother you? She considered the honest answer. Yes, she said, but I can only fight the fight in front of me. I can't fight every version of it everywhere. That was a thing she'd had to make her peace with, and she wasn't entirely at peace with it yet, and she suspected she might not be for some time. Justice, in her experience, was rarely the clean and complete thing that people wanted it to be. It was partial, provisional, dependent on who had the energy to pursue it and who had the resources to endure. Pike would face no legal consequence for what he'd attempted. The shell company would simply dissolve and reappear somewhere else under a different name and the same intentions. The territorial office would complete its review, find nothing improper in the counterpetitioner's claims, close the file, and move on to the next matter. What they would have was their land, which was not nothing, which was, in fact, everything. The Territorial Surveyor General's office sent its findings in June, a formal letter addressed to all 5 families in the consolidated filing, confirming that their claims were in good standing and that the initial review request had been withdrawn by the petitioning party. The shell company question had been referred to a separate administrative process that would take months and produce, Gore warned them, probably nothing actionable. Mara read the letter standing at the kitchen table, then folded it and put it in the tin box with the claim documents, and stood for a moment with her hand on the lid. 8 months. That was how long it had been since she'd ridden out of Blackthorn Crossing on red in the early morning with her canvas pack and a stubborn, cautious, suspicious thing at the back of her chest that she'd been careful not to call hope. 8 months of the hardest winter she'd experienced, and the particular slow work of learning to occupy the same space as another person without either of them losing the shape of themselves. She took her hand off the tin box and went outside. The bench above the tree line was a different place in June than it had been in any other season she'd seen it. The snow was gone from everything but the highest north-facing pockets, and the meadow to the east of the homestead was green in the particular vivid way of high-altitude grass that has waited 6 months for sunlight and is not wasting a moment of it. The creek to the east was running fast and full with snowmelt, louder than it would be by August, filling the mornings with a sound that she had come to find deeply settling. Rourke was in the cleared ground south of the cabin, working on the expansion they'd planned across the winter, another half-acre broken from the edge of the meadow, which would give them enough ground for a proper kitchen garden and room for the grain plot they'd talked about. He was moving rocks from the ground and stacking them along what would become the border of the plot. And he was doing it with the same unhurried, methodical attention he gave everything, and he looked from where she stood at the cabin door like a natural feature of the place, like something the mountain had put there on purpose. She walked out to tell him about the letter. He stopped and read it and handed it back without saying anything for a long moment. He looked at the mountains to the north, the ones that sat behind the homestead, like a permanent fact, gray and white and indifferent. "It's done then," he said. "The land part," she said. "Yes." He picked up another rock. "The rest of it goes on." She understood what he meant by that. The rest of it, the work of the homestead, the seasons ahead, the ongoing negotiation of being 2 people with strong opinions and different habits trying to build something together, that didn't resolve. It just continued. There was no document that finalized it, no letter from a territorial office declaring the matter settled. She'd been thinking about that a great deal, across the winter and into the spring, about what it meant to choose something, not in the single dramatic moment of choice, but in the accumulated smaller choices that followed it. In September, she'd said all right in a public square with 300 people watching, and that had felt like the decision. But the real decisions had come after, in the daily, unglamorous, frequently frustrating work of being present and useful and honest with a person she was still in the ongoing process of understanding. The dramatic moment was the door. The life was what happened after you walked through it. She was not the person she'd been in September. She knew that without being entirely sure what she'd become instead, which was probably how it was supposed to go. "Rourke," she said. He looked at her. "I need to tell you something." She folded the letter and held it in both hands. I don't have a clean way to say this, so I'm just going to say it. I came up here because I had nothing to lose, and I was tired of losing nothing, which is its own kind of exhausting. I didn't come up here because I trusted you. I came up here because I trusted myself enough to believe I could handle whatever this turned out to be." He waited. "But somewhere in the middle of the winter," she said, "it stopped being about handling it. It became something else." She looked at him directly. "I don't know the full shape of what it is yet, but I thought you should know it changed." He set the rock down. He was quiet for long enough that she felt the particular vulnerability of having said a true thing out loud and having to wait for someone else to decide what to do with it. She was not good at that kind of waiting. She'd spent most of her life avoiding it precisely because it gave other people the power to diminish her, and other people had historically been willing to use that power. "I know," he said. "I've been watching it change. I didn't want to name it before you were ready to." She looked at him. "I might not be ready now." "That's all right," he said. "It doesn't have to be finished to be real." She stood there in the June morning with the creek running fast to the east and the cleared ground between them and the mountains at their backs. And she thought about all the things she'd believed about herself that had turned out to be wrong. Or not wrong exactly, but incomplete. The conclusions of a person who'd been working from insufficient evidence because the circumstances of her life had made certain kinds of evidence impossible to gather. She had believed she was someone who survived alone. That had been true as far as it went. She'd just never had the chance to discover whether surviving together might be a different thing entirely. Not easier, not softer, but different in the way that matters. Harder in new places and lighter in old ones. The first time she went back to Blackthorn Crossing after the territorial letter arrived, it was for the Henley family's summer gathering, an annual affair Ruth had written that Frank held on the East Meadow every July. And she and Rourke were invited this year in a way that made clear the invitation was not a courtesy. She rode down with Rourke on a clear morning in the first week of July, and Blackthorn Crossing looked smaller than she remembered it, which was something people always said about places they'd left, and she'd always assumed was sentiment rather than fact. But it was genuinely smaller, not diminished, just correctly sized, the way things look when you've stopped being inside them and can see the actual dimensions. The Henley gathering had 30-some people in it, spread across the East Meadow, with food on long tables and children running between the adults' legs, and the general noise of a community that was, in the main, relieved about something. Several people she'd known across the years came to speak to her, and the conversations had a different texture than the conversations she'd had in this town for the past 8 years. Not warmer exactly, or not only warmer but more level. More like two people talking than like a settled member of a community making allowances for an uncertain one. Frank Henley shook her hand when they arrived. He shook it like he meant it. "That letter you wrote to Gore," he said. "The cover letter, the one that started the whole filing. Aldous Webb told me he used the language from it in 3 other cases this year." He looked at her steadily. "You've got a mind for that kind of thing." "I've had to," she said. "I know it," he said. "It's a waste that nobody around here noticed it sooner." She didn't know quite what to do with that, so she said, "Thank you, Frank," which was true and sufficient, and moved on. Britt Henderson found her near the food tables and gripped her arm with both hands and asked about the calf and about the homestead and about the winter in a way that was hungry for details, the way of a woman who misses conversation with someone she considers worth talking to. Mara found herself giving real answers instead of safe ones, which was its own kind of pleasure. It was Clara Hughes who surprised her. She came across the meadow in the middle of the afternoon, when the gathering was in full warmth, and Mara was sitting on the fence at the edge of the meadow, watching Rourke talk with Cale Henley about something that involved a lot of gesturing toward the North Ridge. Clara stopped a few feet away and stood there with the particular posture of someone who has rehearsed something and found the rehearsed version inadequate now that the moment had come. "I want to say something to you," Clara said. Mara looked at her and waited. "I've said unkind things about you over the years," Clara said. "Some of them in public. I told myself they were true or that you'd done something to deserve them, but that wasn't—" She stopped. "They were unkind because I wanted them to be. And that's a different thing. And I knew it then, and I know it better now." Mara sat on the fence and looked at this woman who had spent the better part of a decade adding her voice to the architecture of rumor and exclusion that had made Mara's life in Blackthorn Crossing what it was. She thought about whether she was supposed to say it was all right, which it wasn't, not entirely, not yet. The damage done by years of that particular kind of social cruelty didn't simply evaporate because someone had the decency to acknowledge it. "I hear you," Mara said finally. "I'm not going to pretend it didn't cost me anything, because it did. But I hear you." Clara nodded. She looked like she'd expected less and was uncertain what to do with more. She walked away, and Mara watched her go and felt something that was not quite forgiveness, and not quite its absence. Something in between, something that required more time and probably more evidence before it could fully become one thing or the other. That was honest. Honesty, she'd decided, was worth more than the clean emotional resolution that people expected in stories about reconciliation and redemption. Real reconciliation was slow and awkward and uncertain, and the people involved were imperfect, and sometimes it worked out and sometimes it didn't. And the best you could do was stay truthful about where you actually were in the process. They rode back up to the homestead in the long evening light of July, when the sun was still well above the western ridgeline, and the air smelled of warm grass and pine and the particular sweetness of a mountain summer. The trail was easy now, familiar in a way it hadn't been in September. Mara knew every difficult section, every place where the footing changed, every turn where the view opened up. She knew this trail the way she knew the floor plan of the cabin and the drainage pattern of the bench and the sound the creek made in different seasons. She knew this place, that it happened slowly, without announcement, the way most things that matter actually happen. "You were quiet at the gathering," Rourke said, riding alongside her on the upper section where the trail widened. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" She considered how to say it. "About what changes and what doesn't. Claire Hughes apologized to me today." He glanced at her. "How did that go?" "Awkwardly," she said, "which is probably the right way for it to go, given what it was." She paused. "I've been thinking about what people in Blackthorn Crossing used to say about me, that I was bad luck, that I was the reason Thomas died, that I was damaged in some way that made me unsuitable." She looked at the trail ahead. "For a long time I argued with it in my head, told myself they were wrong, but arguing with something is still being in a relationship with it. I spent years being defined by what they said, even when I was fighting it." Rourke was quiet, listening in the way he listened, fully, without the urge to fill space. "What changed," she said, "is that I stopped arguing, not because they were right, but because somewhere up on that mountain this winter, I got too busy doing real things to have room for the argument anymore." She glanced at him. "You gave me that. Not by being kind, though you were, most of the time, by treating the work as real and my part in it as real. That's what people had been withholding. Not kindness, just the acknowledgement that what I did mattered and how I thought about things was worth taking seriously." He rode beside her for a moment without speaking. The gray horse moved easily under him, accustomed to the trail. Below them, through the trees, the last light on the valley floor was going gold. "I saw that in September," he said. "What you just described. I saw it from a distance, and I wanted to be near it." A pause. "I'm not a man who's good at explaining himself." "I know," she said. "You're better at it than you think." "Don't tell anyone, Tot," he said, and she laughed. A real laugh. Not the careful, measured kind she'd been producing in public for years, but the kind that came up from somewhere genuine, and it surprised her a little, the way it felt. The homestead came into view as they crested the last rise, the cabin sitting solid on the bench in the evening light, the new cleared ground to the south showing the beginning of what it would become, the barn with the horses waiting inside for the familiar sounds of return. The creek caught the last of the light to the east and threw it back. She had not built this. She had not built most of it, but she was here now, and what grew from here would have her hands in it, and that was a kind of belonging she'd stopped believing she could have. Not the belonging of being accepted by people who'd decided she was acceptable, but the belonging that came from making yourself essential to a place through years of actual work. The mountain didn't give that. It had to be earned from it, the same as everything else up here. There was a particular kind of person, Mara had come to understand, who went through their life waiting to be seen before they would allow themselves to become, waiting for someone to confirm that they were worth the space they took up, worth the effort, worth the risk of being known. She had been that person, at least partly, for a long time. The waiting had the feeling of prudence, but the structure of a trap, because the confirmation never came, or came too late, or came from people who didn't actually know her well enough for it to mean what she needed it to mean. What she'd learned, at 31 years old, on a mountain homestead 2 days' hard ride from the nearest settlement, was that the waiting was the wrong approach entirely. Not because other people's regard didn't matter. It did, it always would. But because worth wasn't a thing that got assigned to you from outside. It was a thing you demonstrated daily, in the specific and unglamorous work of staying present and useful and honest in the life you were actually living. The people who mattered would see it, eventually, because you couldn't hide real work if you kept doing it long enough. Rourke had seen it from 50 feet away at a public gathering in September, which made him either unusually perceptive or proof that she'd been doing real work long enough that it had become visible even at a distance. She'd decided it was probably both. They unsaddled the horses and put them up for the night and went inside, and she built up the fire in the stove while he checked the latch on the barn door that had been giving trouble. And when he came back in, she had coffee on, and the kitchen was warm, and the letter from the territorial office was in its tin box on the shelf where she'd put it that morning. Done. That part at least done. "What do you want to do with the South plot?" she asked when he sat down. "This fall, I mean. Planning for next year." "I want to try winter wheat on the lower section," he said. "The drainage is right for it now, with the diversion trench. Upper section, more root vegetables, storage crops." He looked at her. "You had thoughts on it." "Beans on the upper section," she said. "They'll fix the nitrogen, then rotate to grain the year after." He nodded. "Better." She sat down across from him. The stove ticked as it heated. Outside, the mountain was doing what the mountain always did in the summer evenings, settling into its own silence, the wind dropping, the temperature falling in the specific clean way of high-altitude nights that were never fully warm even in July. She thought about September, about standing in the square in Blackthorn Crossing in her canvas pack and her working clothes while Delbert Marsh performed his contempt for a crowd that found it amusing. About the specific feeling of making yourself small so that other people's smallness has less to bounce off of. About the 3 words that had come from the direction she'd least expected anything to come from. She thought about what it cost to be seen, not the performance of being seen, the actual thing, the sustained and imperfect and frequently uncomfortable process of letting someone know you well enough to see you accurately. It cost more than most people were willing to pay, which was why most people settled for the easier transaction of being known at a surface level and left the rest of themselves locked away in a place they'd convinced themselves was protection, but was actually just loneliness with better lighting. She hadn't meant to pay that cost. She'd ridden up the mountain in October with her seeds and her tools and her cast iron skillet and her carefully maintained distance from her own, hoping, and somewhere in the middle of a brutal winter and a land dispute and a root cellar argument and 100 evenings by a fire talking about things that mattered, she'd paid it anyway. She found she didn't regret it. That was the thing that surprised her most. "Rourke," she said. He looked up from his coffee. "I think this is going to work," she said. Not performing optimism, not performing anything, just saying the thing she actually believed out loud, in the kitchen of a homestead on a mountain bench at the edge of everything, to the one person who had looked at her from 50 feet away and decided she was worth walking toward. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "I think so too." Outside, the last light left the sky in the gradual way of summer, unhurried, as if it had nowhere particular to be. The creek ran east toward the valley. The mountains stood where they had always stood. The homestead sat on its bench exactly as it had been built to sit, rough in the bones, solid in the bones, still unfinished and still worth finishing. Everything real was like that, in the end. Not complete, not perfect, just worth the continuing.